In this recording, I want to highlight the challenges of working within an external framework alone with a book or a recording. And so the first thing is just to acknowledge that for probably 50 to 95%, and I would guess closer on average to 90% of all learning, of all healing, of all teaching today is being done in mass-produced format. So the interpersonal storytelling, the elder bonding, the kind of one-on-one mentoring and kind of ways of engaging have been going down, and what's replaced them is books, YouTube, cassettes, programs, and that the Lazaris material is part of that wave and I think it's defined, the defining element is scale. Because whether you're in a workshop with, 1,000 people or 500 people or 100 people, or you're listening to a cassette alone, with that's been produced for, tens of thousands of people, there's going to be nuances that don't fit the particular situation. That if a personal relationship was there, it could be worked out and kind of sorted out, just like in medicine. Generally people are dehydrated, but sometimes people are overhydrated and are depleting, trace minerals and stuff. And so there isn't an easy one-fits-all protocol, meaning there is a cost to mass market efficiency, and that cost is personalized nuance. And the way that's showing up for me today, working with a Lazaris tape called, it's a yellow label, Connecting, Healing the Child Within. So it's a 28-day program. And so, and Lazaris says you may want to take notes to kind of detail the process. Since, so I would say the first thing is I haven't made a decision one way or another. I will take notes, I won't. The second is I find it to be somewhat exhausting to try to write down things in as much detail as I want to communicate. There's so many things going on so fast that I'm already, it seems like, spending 30% of my entire day just processing things. And so, because if you're gonna process or write something down, the details are what matter. And so, I can have a 5-minute thought, or I can have a 10-second thought, and it can take an hour to write that down clearly, and what it means, and where it came from, and what were the different layers of the thought and what are the implications of the thought. And my hands are exhausted after an hour of this, and I, because there's so much of that, I would say that one of my bigger anxieties is if there's basically three things about my entire day, like I'm not willing to write about the day more than 3 hours a day. It just too absurd, right? I mean, I have 5 thoughts in the morning and then spend the entire day digesting that. It's too absurd. Do an hour each one and then need a break, and then, it's crazy. But what I would say is that there is no built-in limiter. Lazaris will say things like, are you taking notes with excellence? But he doesn't point out the obvious felt human experience that if you take notes with excellence about everything, you're still going to lag behind if all you do your entire day is take notes. Because then you've got notes about the notes, and then notes about those notes, and it's that there's no framework for prioritizing, and this is, I would say, one of my biggest criticisms, because I would say it's where I've gotten into the weeds with working with Lazaris. It's a criticism of the group. It's a criticism, the Lazaris friends. It's a criticism of Lazaris. It's a criticism of concept synergy that I have never heard articulated. What's the break? When do you say, fuck it, we've got life to live, not just listen to Lazaris tapes. That's now, as I say that, I just remember one comment. I can't even remember where the tape was, but I think Lazaris was saying if you're meditating like 5 times a day, that's probably too much. So Lazaris has said something to limit. So I think he was saying more than 5 meditations a day was too much. But does he, and maybe he sticks to that standard in the intensives as well. But the point is that there is there's just an exponential amount of note taking, and so one way that I've processed that is just to get rid of the entire Lazaris material for years. So that's been one solution. Another solution is just do the meditation. So when I first came back and worked with Lazaris, I just said, I'm not going to get bogged down in Lazaris's joke of pretending that 42 steps that relate to 10 different tapes is a 7-step process, right? We'll just outline the simple 7-step process, Lazaris says, and then he says, step 1, do this, do this, do this, do this, don't do this, and then do this, and if you need to find out, then we've talked about it in this other tape. That's not step 1. That's step 47. Particularly when you get the other tape involved. And then step 2 is, and so, yes, you can make everything into a 7-step process as long as you have an A, B, C, D, E infinitum until and you just call that step 1. And then you can have, and if something is actually 7 steps, you just list 7. And if it's 47 steps, you just batch them one, into each one. But, I don't call that a 7-step process. I call that a 47-step tangle. And the question, when there are so many things that can be done, more exercise, better diet, tending to finances, the question is, which of these literally thousands of things have more grace to them? And that's something that, Lazaris does not, does not, well, it's a conversation I have never heard ever within the Lazaris community. And I think it's one of the most important conversations that I have never heard. Meaning it's absolutely vital to a clear distinction, which is that everything is toxic at very high doses and everything is medicinal in the right context at a certain dose. And the dose is not really addressed. And in fact, the way that the community deals with just about any problem or criticism is just to recommend 3 to 5 tapes and then have zero accountability because clearly you were in your negative ego if none of them work. So the whole thing is a racket on that level. And so I just did meditations for a bit and found that they were beneficial. And so this is one of a few tapes that I'm actually kind of going through and listening to the process. And I'm doing it because it was so effective when I was 15, 16 years old to heal the inner child. And so the way I'm coming to this is, I told one of my partners for years that the single most important thing, because she had a severe trauma history, was to start the day with working on loving her inner child. And she began, had fabulous results, and then stopped it immediately and had terrible results. And so when she insisted on having terrible results year after year after year and refusing to do any work after it was working perfectly, that's apparently why she stopped it, then we've separated. And so one of the things that I'm finding valuable is to take the advice that I gave to her and just do that. Because my life has always improved when I take my own advice, and most people don't take my advice. When they do, their life improves. And that's always nice to see, but typically I find it's good to give people good advice, expect them to ignore it, which they do 90% of the time, and then if I want my life to improve, take my own advice. And so for years I told her this is the single most important thing you can do, and so why don't I do that? So that's kind of how I zero in on that. Past success plus it's the main advice that I've given that worked when it was taken and caused problems when it was not taken. Now, the particular fragility or the kind of delicacy of getting into the Lazaris techniques or detailed instructions again is first of all that anytime I try or decide I will do something, there is an immediate terror that I'm going to do it wrong and I'm going to be punished. So this is PTSD history. And I would, of course, love to see Lazaris do more work on PTSD as one of the single most important issues in humanity and one of the most hardest to deal with alone, and also one that has a lot of bad therapy around it. So that's what's absolutely needed, and so it's irritating that Lazaris has chosen, I would say, as far as I can tell, 70% of the destructive chronic behavior that people know how to do it differently. In other words, they know something like saving money or exercise or not eating sugar or whatever it is. They know what it is. Their life would be better. And 70% of their suffering is because they're not doing it, and they're not doing it. While Lazaris would say this is negative ego and blah, 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 in my observation, 70% of that is coping mechanisms for unresolved trauma and PTSD that are not acknowledged. So the trauma is not acknowledged, its severity is not acknowledged, and the coping mechanism is not understood. And so if you try to discipline over it or shame it, or you should do this meditation, it often backfires or can kind of lead. The sophistication of the model for understanding the map is just not there. And so it's disappointing that Lazaris has chosen this key, pivotal area that is responsible, as far as I can tell, in my own life and watching others and looking at the data, to be responsible for 70% of human suffering. Meaning if 70% of people understood trauma, healed trauma, and honored their coping mechanisms and found better ones, that their lives would change without a single Lazaris tape. And I also think that Lazaris could do a better job of exploring some of that. Lazaris is working on it peripherally at best. I would say it is the single number one human crisis, and there is not a single Lazaris tape on understanding and healing trauma, PTSD, and complex PTSD, and that all of the people feeling guilty and shame in the Lazaris community because the relationship and love tapes do not work statistically within the community, because they don't. Just gather any group of 100 Lazaris friends anywhere in the world, workshop or otherwise, and dig into their relationships. And what you will find is shame, a certain amount of secrecy, misunderstanding, self-shame, a lot of failure, a lot of pain, and it's not worth bringing up in the community because they'll just send you back to tapes that don't work, which is disappointing. That as a status quo is spiritual abuse, ineffective, painful, and a big reason that I don't want buy-in to the Lazaris community on those terms, meaning that that's not a contract that I want to agree to or sign up to or agree to be silent about. And it is the terms that are largely offered and have been offered over most of the 50 years that I've been aware of Lazaris. And so that's one of many sources of pain, dissatisfaction, sadness, and failure. It's a chronic source of failure at every level of the material in the community, and it's it's just what it is at this stage. Now, I do going back to my own experience, I feel as a physically violated and emotionally shamed and humiliated child and adolescent, it's that's with Lazaris stuff sugar coated on top of that. And just to give you one small example of that, Lazaris will talk about senseless violence, and you create your own reality, and whatever. The only reason, the main reason that both of my parents stopped hitting and shaming me was I had to punch my father once. He's one of like 5 people in my entire life that I had to punch. It was the only way to stop him coming into my room. And after calling the police and it was the most bizarre conversation with the police I could imagine. So I recorded the whole thing. I have the tape today. These things are so insane that, and there's so much complete denial of the insanity and that it ever happened. Like, oh, that never happened. It's just layer upon layer of abuse. But the last level of abuse is, the last 2 levels is, first, it never happened, and second, you're wrong for feeling the way you feel because it never happened, and then third, if it did happen, it was nothing. So I mean, these are the last 3 levels of the burial system of truth, beauty, dignity. And so, recording things has been, my one of my few defenses. So, I ran across this cassette in which I had recorded the conversation with the police officer. And the police officer was trying to get me, as a 14-year-old boy, to agree never to hit my parents. And it goes round and round. I told the police officer, I said, I have never hit my parents until they have hit me. So this is an obvious opportunity for the police to confront my parents. But that's not what they do. They go back into the loop. They say, we want to stop violence in this house. I want you to agree to me not to hit your parents. And I say to the police officer, I say, are you listening? I've told you I will never hit my parents, and I have never hit my parents unless they hit me. And to go deeper into that, I told my parents, I'm not going to escalate. I'm going to match you pound for pound. If, my mother's pretty flimsy and weak, so, she'll slap me, with 5 pounds of force. I could slap her with 50 pounds of force, but I'm not going to do it. I'll slap her with 5 pounds of force. And I could, punch her up, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to slap her right on the cheek where she slapped me. And if she doesn't like that, all she has to do is stop using physical violence to process her own rage and bullshit. That's all she has to do. And she'll never be hit ever again. And the police went back to, I want you to agree. And I said, you know, they've stopped hitting me. They're not hitting me anymore. And do you know why? Because I punched my dad once. He's not going to hit me again, right? He's a coward. My mom's a narcissist. She's not going to hit me again because she doesn't want to be hit. She doesn't give a shit about what I want or what's good for me or my dignity or any of that. I was already working with the Lazaris material for 2 fucking years by this point, so I had a few, you know, awarenesses of you know, emotional literacy. But it's just, you know, and my parents stopped hitting me. They never hit me again. The police was unsuccessful at convincing me never to promise. See, because that would release the violence. As soon as I promised the police I would never hit my parents again, I would keep the promise, because unlike my parents, I don't tell lies. And then my parents would start hitting me again with immunity. Right? My physical violence stopped the abuse when I was 14 years old. And it discouraged the abuse with my younger siblings. Though it didn't stop them, because my younger siblings were much more interested in currying favor with my parents. Lazaris has never dealt with reality. Lazaris would rather shame a 14-year-old boy, you know, talking about senseless violence and this and that, rather than deal with the fact that, as far as I can tell, giving my father a punch and giving my mother a slap was one of the best techniques available to me throughout my childhood. It worked better than any Lazaris techniques to stop the shame. So go fuck yourself, Lazaris. You know, if you don't want to deal with reality, then don't give out techniques to abuse teenagers, because it's spiritual abuse. It's sick. And it's even sicker that Helen Avalon you know, did a big shaming thing when I talked about my anger at Lazaris when I was 20. Go fuck yourself, Helen. Get some therapy and learn how to stick up for kids, right? So Lazaris shames abused teenagers. Concept Synergy shames abused teenagers on multiple levels. Penny shamed abused teenagers on multiple levels. And so does the Jach and Lazaris Forum. That's not a contract of ignorance, abuse, or anything that I want anything to do with. Right? And so it becomes, for me, like, I don't have a clear model for understanding that that's not okay. I want no part of it. And I also understand that there's no place for this truth in the forum, the Jach and Lazaris community. It's a community of cult cover-up. There's no place for it. I have never, ever found anyone within the community that was excited to talk about this. And this is the single biggest area the community is potentiated to grow. Meaning, I believe that if Jach, Lazaris, Concept Synergy, and the community dealt with conversations like this in a healthy way and say, yes, here's another truth teller, let's deal with this, I think the material, the work, the community would be about 10 times bigger than it is. Maybe 100 times, maybe 1,000 times. because you're engaging reality rather than running from it. You're engaging with feedback rather than suppressing it. You're following the data rather than hiding the data. And you're engaging with science rather than following dogma, right? And so Scientology is a cult that doesn't want to deal with reality and data. It's dying out because it's not dealing with valid, healthy criticism. At the moment you become a dogma that dissociates from reality and you can't deal with reality, you die out. And that's as it should be. Cults do that all the time and have done that throughout history. 10,000 cults estimated to exist in human history, 10,000 cultures, 95% of them are all dead. And, it's the dogma that kills a cult. But it's also the dogma that creates cohesion. And so it's this balance between can you stay in integrity and can you stay vital, right? Because if you splinter too much as an identity, as a cult, you can't integrate again. Right? If everyone talks a slightly different language, nobody understands each other, and the cult has no identity. But if the cult just repeats dead, tired frameworks without being willing to confront and deal with reality, you become irrelevant. Christianity is largely irrelevant because of its dogmas. It's not that the core messages of forgiveness and this and that are terrible. It's the dogma that's killing it. So anyway, that's I don't have a very clear framework for how to navigate the territory because I just don't. And so so that's difficult. And of course Lazaris hasn't dealt with that other than to say, and this is liberating, and I appreciate this, Lazaris says, all techniques or all beliefs are false, so pick the ones that work. That's liberating. So, when Lazaris doesn't work, pick something else. When Lazaris does work with it. I mean, that seems like a very clear scientific framework. So that's useful. And that brings me back to, healing the inner child. And so, in this framework of working with the inner child, week 1, miraculous, fantastic resonances. I've never felt so good in months. So the best I've felt in months. Fantastic. Week number 2, fantastic. Week number 3, actually week number 2 a little bit difficult because a lot of the inner child that showed up, and so this was already a little bit of a challenge. The age of my inner child, which is kind of 0 to 11, changed. So I was dealing with probably 7 years old down to infantile, and it was slowly regressing. So I kind of started around 7, went all the way down to infant. How do you talk to a 2-year-old? I don't know. It didn't totally connect, but the strongest energy was dealing with a 2-year-old. Now the other thing, and this is why I feel let down by Lazaris in refusing to deal directly with PTSD and trauma and the reenactment of abuse. Now, he's talked about it a bit in Shame, but one of the scarier moments for me doing this inner child work is I would come towards my child, and there would be flashes when I would identify with the abusive parent, because the traumatized inner child was so helpless, so devastated, so terrified. I didn't want to feel that. I didn't want to connect with that. And so I became the abuser. Now, Lazaris does not anticipate that in the recording, which he should, because it's actually very, very common. The people that need inner child healing the most, for example, are the people who have been abused the most. The people who have been abused the most are the people who are traumatized the most. The people who are traumatized the most are the most likely to have PTSD. The people who have PTSD are the most likely to dissociate from themselves as the victim of abuse. And the people who dissociate from themselves, the ego needs an identity, and so it flips from identifying with the abused, terrified child to the abuser. Now, to me, it is a scary thing to notice rage come up towards this little infant. So I'm going towards this infant, and I know that the infant, I understand the assignment is to love the infant, etc. So I'm gearing up for that. And as I walk towards the child, I feel this intense rage and desire to strangle the child. Now, thanks to people like Bessel van der Kolk, who has not shied away from PTSD and trauma, the way I feel Lazaris is quite negligent in doing, I understand what's going on. So I have a mental model that doesn't shame me for this. It is scary, because I wasn't expecting it, and I don't know what's going to come up next. I don't know quite what the boundaries are in this psychic territory. But I do understand, it is so painful for me to feel what it was like to be so decimated by these fucking assholes called parents, which I do appreciate Lazaris having the decency to point out were children and adolescents. Right? So Lazaris has had the decency to say, your parents, many of them were adolescents, many of them were children, right? They're not adults just because they fuck, right? There's nothing to do with it. And I do appreciate that, because that's absolutely true. And it brings up the crisis again and again in my life when I see that I'm not an adult, and I look around me and I can't find a single adult anywhere that I can consult. Finding an adult is the hardest thing I know. They're almost nowhere in vast swaths of the world. And you can recognize this because an adult is naturally responds in a way that is good for the well-being of the ecology, the group, and the people in the group. So the adult tends and responds in a way that supports the best in the natural ecology and the cultural and personal ecology. Right? That is how you recognize an adult. And when everyone turns their head down as soon as there's a problem and looks the other way, you realize there isn't a single adult in the room. There isn't a single adult in the neighborhood. There isn't a single adult. It's it is a crisis, and I can look at it and say, well, I'm not an adult, and say, yeah, exactly. How do I learn how to be an adult from children? Right? And what Lazaris is not, quite kind enough to say is that, most of the people at Concept Synergy and most of the Lazaris friends are not adults. I won't say all of them. There may be the odd one. But where are the adults? And how do you learn to be an adult when you've never met one? And it's tricky, because you think, oh, that was an adult, wasn't it? But no, that's not an adult thing to do. My parents hired a very nice woman to diagnose my learning disabilities, which were really my symptoms of complex PTSD from their abuse. And what was so interesting reading the report was that there was no mention of any of the family abuse. There was no effort to investigate it. All the psychologist did was observe my symptoms of severe childhood trauma and put names on them. And my parents felt very relieved and paid her lots of money because she left them out of the picture. And I realized my parents would never have paid her if she had told them, you terrorized this boy, you give him nightmares. And it's very difficult to focus on a fucking blackboard saying, see cat run, when the cat isn't real. Who gives a shit about the fucking cat? It has nothing to do with real life. And what he's actually wondering is this unsolvable problem. How is he not going to get hit and tormented mentally and psychologically as soon as he gets home? How's he going to feel the next time you do your abandonment game? Right? I'm leaving and never coming back. It's your fault. How's he going to deal with that? How's he going to deal with you lying and cheating to one another as parents? How's he going to deal with that? That's what he needs to know how to deal with, not see a fucking cat run on an imaginary blackboard at school. And you're too dumb to figure that out? You have to hire a fucking psychologist? But the psychologist gives the abuser what they want to hear. It's not an adult. It's not sticking up for the child. And the child gets a label, and the parents get to feel vindicated. Go fuck yourselves. It's not adult, right? My wonderful Waldorf teacher, anyway, I mean, I don't know what adulthood looks like because it's so rare. It would be so nice to find anyone who would stick up for a child being hit, right? They don't. They know it's wrong. They just say, I don't want to be hit or, have a police altercation with this person, so they sacrifice the child. It's not adult, right? And so, anyway, that's a side, story here. It's a big one, but it's like, how do you sort out what to do when all of this unknown energy comes in? So I understood that I was losing association with my inner child in enormous pain because it was so devastating. It was so hard to feel what that felt like. So I'm identifying with the abuser. And that's how transference happens. That's how intergenerational abuse happens. Is if you terrify and abuse a child enough, the ego cannot deal with that level of helplessness. And so in order to survive as an identity, it will medicate the helplessness of the abuse by switching identification to the power that the abuser feels when they're hitting the child. And so that's how it happens. That's how, when that flip occurs, the ego survives and has integrity that it can tolerate, but it's now identifying with its abuser rather than identifying with the helplessness of itself. And so now you have an abuser identity. And it's just an exact coping mechanism mirror of your abuser's identity, in this case my parents. So as I felt the rage that I felt, I said, that's my dad. That's how he felt when I was hurt, when I needed him, when I needed love. He felt desperate rage because he's never done his inner child work, and despite working with Lazaris, and he never grew up, and he can't stand the fact that I'm reminding him of his own helpless, terrified child. And he wants to silence it, and he wants to shut it up, and he wants to feel the power that his father felt when he was beaten. So that's how it works. And so knowing that from complex trauma work, meaning reading the book, I could say, okay, that's what's going on. I need to slow down. I need to come back. I need to reground with my love for my child and see if I can tolerate a connection. Because if I can't, I'm going to flip into the abuser. Can I face my own helplessness is another way of saying it. Now, I knew that not from Lazaris, but from good work by Bessel van der Kolk and my own investigations and analysis of trauma. And it was just a blip. Meaning a few seconds later, I'm back into love. But without that training, and this is where I criticize the Lazaris material because it's incomplete, without that training, I wouldn't have a clue what's wrong. Like, am I bad? Am I evil? Why am I doing this? And what should I do? Should I stop the meditation? What should I do? Because unfortunately, many therapists don't have a clue in this territory. So that's maddening. And so I worked through that thanks to my trauma training. And then fantastic, week number 2, week number 3. Going into week number 4, the first time, I feel completely left out. I feel shame. I feel humiliated. I feel left behind when my child is kind of being given in the 4th week is to give the child to the higher self and then give the child to Lazaris. And then Lazaris kind of covers the child up and takes the child away to work with. First of all, I couldn't feel any alchemy in the whole meditation. And then secondly, all I felt was this kind of slight numbness. Now, so I didn't know what to do about that either, right? And so this is the price of putting out, mass market materials to complex, unique individuals without a complete set of instructions. And that's just, that's the price. That price is borne by Lazaris's, quote, friends, the people who pay Lazaris and Concept Synergy money, but that do not get adequate support to navigate this territory. Not a very friendly thing to do, actually. And, so what to do? Well, as I say, I'm exhausted by notes, so I have a system. I'm using it right now. It's a system of voice recording. Like if I talk something through, then I I can see things that I otherwise don't see, and not just exhaust myself with trying to write this down. Like, I don't actually know how to write fast enough and clear enough because I have more permission to improvise vocally than I do in writing. Sentences and syntax, etc., which it's hard to punctuate a free-flowing narration like this, plus spell checking and all that. It's just a headache. And so I made a recording like this, and in that recording, I discovered that I felt grief, unlovable, hurt, abandoned, all alone, left behind. And that's not the prediction in the model. Right? This is why it irritates me when Lazaris just spouts without ever asking that their techniques work. Yes, Lazaris, your technique works if a certain percentage of your highly traumatized, quote, friends end up feeling like they want to strangle their inner child. You could call that working without any clue what to do about it or why, or how not to make it worse, right? So you didn't provide that. That's provided by others. You talk about being the most evolved presence on the whole planet, but you missed that. Pretty basic, right? It's irritating. Stop puffing your own horn and deal with data. So so this is the next bump. So what's going on? And I had to talk out loud to a recorder for 20 minutes to have a clue what's going on. Now, it's just a working model, right? Lazaris isn't there to talk to. Concept Synergy blown any trust away possibly to talk to about this, if they even bother to be helpful. It's who to talk to about this, basically. Anyway, I talked it through, and then I realized I'm leaving a big chunk of my child behind. Then I looked at, well, how did that happen? Well, Lazaris does not deal with this in the tape, but I started around age 7 and slowly regressed to like 1 and 2 years old. And that wasn't predicted or discussed in the tape either. It's what happened, and I have to decide as it's happening, am I going off track or on track? I'll trust the energy if it's strong, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the meditation just veers off to the left, and I don't know if that's a defense, an avoidance, or Lazaris didn't account for that. And that's an unnerving decision to make in a split second as it's happening, because it can be all of those. I've gone way off track into things and gotten lost because I just let myself avoid the structure of the meditation. But also some of my best moments have happened allowing myself to transcend the structure of the meditation. Which is it, right? That's a challenge, right? And that's it'd be nice, frankly, if Lazaris discussed those types of things, though it could just add to the weight of perfectionism and the whole terror and all of that of making mistakes. I don't know, but what I do know is I realized that I was not the adult doing this meditation. I was 7, 8, 9, and 10 who hadn't got the healing yet. So apparently the meditation of healing the inner child can work when you are identified with the inner child. In other words, when you are the inner child, healing the inner child, because, as I say, I'm sure I've met a few adults. I just can't think who they are. And I think more accurate, some people are an adult some of the time. And I can't think of anyone who's an adult when I enter certain territory with them, which is the territory where an adult is most needed and least available. And I'm sure I'm an adult from time to time, but not when I desperately need to be an adult, which is in the territory where I never had an adult. And so it's kind of a catch-22, maddening, enraging, frustrating as hell. Certainly not an area I would call the Lazaris techniques to work. But basically, that's my working model. And so I realized, I have to go back, do another week dealing with 7 to 10-year-old, because for whatever reason, he's left out of the whole process. And I also realize why I never came back to do this meditation again until now. This happened before. Meaning, when you have traumatic splits, again, huge criticism for Lazaris for not bringing this to the forefront. When you have traumatic splits, you can do the whole Lazaris technique for healing the inner child for one split. That split, and there could be 1,000 splits. It could be 10 splits. It could be 3 really, really big splits. That split is now healed. But Lazaris doesn't mention the fact that you're never doing the whole package at one time. You've done it for one split. One traumatized self that was presenting itself at the time. So literally, and this gets into both the agonizing, maddening, maze of this whole thing. You could probably do the inner child routine month after month for 10 years and still have some splits. But at the very least, it's as if right now I'm doing it as if I've never done it before. So that's what I'm going to go back and do based on that hypothesis, which again, I have more work, more context for. So I would say, in summary, without the quote note-taking or the talking at length about it, I would just feel lost and that I was doing it wrong, because I wouldn't even know what was happening. I would just know it's not working. And Lazaris and his friends are always quick to say, well, that's because you're a negative ego. It's nothing about us. Right? We just don't create our reality that you do. And so it's just too sickening to get lost in that maze. But with an understanding of trauma and PTSD and why, I feel like I'm over those 2 humps. And so we'll see. I mean, it's a working hypothesis. But I am scared and I am angry that I am doing all this to fuck by myself. I do not know a therapist anywhere in the world that I have confidence I don't have to spend $1,000 of time just educating her. I'm educating therapists all the time about all the shit they don't read about. I'm tired of it. I think I've spent $30,000 so far just educating therapists. And then, do they believe it or not? Do they offer anything helpful? A lot of wheel spinning, another 30,000 spinning wheels. Few great sessions. I don't know of a single therapist in the world that can really help me with this, number one. Lazaris, hopeless. Concept synergy, the Lazaris community, hopeless. Adults, where are they? Right? So this is the challenge, and yeah, and I guess it's part of my more complex, nuanced relationship with Lazaris at this time.